Hello and welcome to Martinis, Eco and Country Bites on Edge Radio Australia. I have a guest today that I have been wanting to interview for many years. We've been friends for some time now, and someone who I really admire for their their expansion on their understanding of the world and the way that there is great discussions between different nations and cultures that we can learn so much from. So I'm going to bring onto the stage my dear friend Aditya. Welcome to my segment Martinis Eco and Country Bites. How are you, my friend?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me on your program.
Lovely, thank you.
How are
Well, I'm
you?
going to now, Aditya. Maybe you could give our lovely people. Oops, excuse me. That's just my twitchy
It's fine.
fingers there. My apologies. um, Maybe we could give some background. I think we met probably what 3 or 4 years ago now.
Yeah, around
Okay.
2020,
Wow. Was it 2003, 23?
maybe yes.
Uh,
2000,
I think
2020.
before. I think it was 2020, 21. But anyway, irrelevant. All we know is that there is a reason why people come into each other's lives because we have so much to
Definitely.
learn from each other, and there's
Yeah.
such a way to connect that um, brings a greater community together, not just understanding what's going on in other nations, but if there's
Yeah.
similarities or there's differences and to learn from that. So you work for the Ministry of Agriculture.
Yeah.
Perhaps you can give an idea of our listeners and viewers here. What exactly was your kind of role in the ministry?
I actually worked with the Minister of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare, the Government of India. I worked very closely with her. She was actually working under the main minister, the cabinet minister, what you call. So I used to
Yeah.
travel extensively, in southern parts of India. India is a huge country, right? And it's even now it's an agrarian, predominantly agrarian economy, right? So, I used to have interactions with the bureaucrats, with the scientists, who used to work on all this agricultural research, and also the farmers, and also the people who are directly or indirectly involved with agriculture. So, it was a very good experience for me. I worked for around 18 months, and it was a great learning for me. Yeah. So, I was able to
Well,
understand a lot.
I bet you did. So at the moment, you're currently based in Bangalore. So we can see there at the
Yeah.
sort of bottom area where it's highlighted in yellow at the bottom and central India.
Yeah.
That's where you're based. And I guess what would you describe as the primary industries that exist in Bangalore?
Bangalore is actually famous for its the information technology, biotech, and also, the ITES related jobs, the outsourcing. Majority of the American and European countries, they do outsource many data related jobs and software related jobs. So Bangalore is the hub, it's called the IT capital of Asia.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a lot. Yeah, I've heard that there's some incredible IT that's coming out of India. I mean, a lot of the industries that are highly upcoming and developing is your pharmaceuticals and health,
Yeah.
as well as uh, IT e-commerce is another one that you guys are
Correct.
really developing in. Um, and it's got listed down here that renewable energy is one that, and that's one that
Mhm.
I talk about a lot on my show about renewable energy. And we've had a quick chat about that. So maybe we could give an idea of like the juxtaposed positions between Australia and India and the history of India and what's going on in Australia, because I think a lot of people take for granted that as a developed nation, that having energy security and food security is something it's quite easy to take for granted when you have that. It's a
Yeah.
baseline that always exists. And so when we go without it, then we have major problems. So in India, that's some of the issues that obviously have been the foundation of a developing nation coming into a developed nation. So,
Yeah.
with your change in the fact that you've got more coal powered stations coming online, so
Hmm.
60% of your energy supply, I believe, comes from coal powered stations, 10% from gas. There's
Hmm.
27 around that from renewables. Um, Hydropower is a big one for India, I believe, that
Yeah.
hydropower provides a lot of consistent energy supply, as well as biomass, solar, and wind.
Yeah.
So perhaps I know that this is not an area that you're an expert of, but in comprehension of how important it is to have baseload energy or constant energy supply, maybe you could put it in the context of what it's been like in a developing nation that you have obviously seen great change over the last, what, 10, 15, 20 years, how important that is to sustain and keep growing or maintaining that into a developed nation.
Yeah, see, the first thing is, when we are comparing India with Australia, Australia obviously is, nearly roughly three times more bigger than, the land size of India. And when it comes to population, it's the largest populated country in the world, right? Nearly 1.4 billion people. So, the energy requirement is high, and the overall the consumption is also very high compared to Australia. So to cater to all these people, definitely we need a lot of energy, and the most important thing is that 80% of our petroleum demand is
Yes.
imported, right? So that takes away chunk of our forex whatever forex reserves, right? So that's a main concern for us. And when it comes to nuclear capability, yes, we are a nuclear power nation, but when it comes to using the nuclear resources for generating power, we still are not much like say, let's say France or Germany, who are predominantly more into the atomic this thing power related things. So yeah, I mean, we are more reliant on coal and hydroelectric power. Yes, we have been blessed with lot of rivers where we can produce hydroelectricity.
Yeah.
So the thing is, when you compare with developed countries, and when you see all these climate change, all these things, right? See, the thing
Mm-hmm.
is, India is being penalized, because the other countries have already developed and they have already utilized those resources where it causes pollution and all other side effects. But when India is in the stage of development, you can't say you stop using these kinds of energy. That's really harsh on a country of this size and population. So that is my opinion. So initially, I mean, we have to gradually move away from these kind of non-renewable energy sources, but it takes time. That's why India has been telling.
Mm-hmm.
But India is committed. If I'm not wrong, maybe by 2070 we will fully switch to renewable
Yeah.
sources of energy. That's what our prime minister has said and committed. And we have also, started implementing this solar panels, right? So that is
Yeah.
also a great step. And we are also focusing more on this hydrogen fuel and electric vehicles.
So Aditya, we had a chat about this just previously, and what you had said to me is that I'm the campaign coordinator for the offshore wind turbines in Western Australia, and you
Mhm.
told me that offshore wind turbines have been banned in India.
Yeah.
Could you explain why?
I don't have much details about that. Maybe it's because of the environmental factors, and also lots of birds gets affected, right? So it's the ecological balance also has to be kept in mind, when we are doing such things. So definitely, it's a good move by the government.
Do you think also it could have been that they realized that in the kind of environment that you do like have as far as like your weather patterns in India, that your monsoon season obviously would have been
Yeah,
catastrophic to probably offshore wind. So this is where I have tried to explain to people, if we're trying to look at combating climate change, whether you believe that's human anthropogenic caused or natural climate change. I always have believed in natural climate change and changing patterns and cycles on the planet. That's something you and I'll get into later on, just changing patterns.
yeah,
But looking at that, if we're saying that we think we have a good baseline understanding or comprehension of this is a safe place to put it because this is the status quo now, but we're also seeing changes in patterns of climate and wind and weather changes and rainfall, then how can we safely say this is where I think India has actually been a bit genius in this one, because they realize probably that putting offshore wind turbines in areas where you've got obviously huge monsoonal tidal flow of water and storms that come through consistently, that it would
yeah.
cause more damage than you would ever get as a baseline energy, which we know that that doesn't supply, so it wouldn't have a good energy supply. Would you say that that's probably a fairly good or accurate assumption for why it wouldn't have been applicable?
I would agree with you because if you see the coastal line, we are having a lot of cyclones and a lot of rainfall during the monsoon season, and it really it's very difficult even for the people to go into fishing, right? So
Yeah.
it would be definitely destructive, and a lot of capital investment goes for a toss. So I would say it's a very good thing not to have offshore, wind turbines.
Yeah. So, I mean, it causes a lot of disruption to natural systems, whether that's
Yes.
a sandy base or substrate or reef system. Um,
Yeah.
but more than that, it doesn't create baseload energy supply. And this is one thing that you comprehend, that as a nation, so when we get into the amount of textiles and other industries, like you have a huge, like you mentioned, um, refinery of petroleum in India. And so to have that, you need to have extremely reliable baseload energy. The same with IT. You're looking at having e-commerce and IT that needs completely consistent energy supply so the grid doesn't collapse.
Yeah.
So so having rolling blackouts is not the goal. We want to have the lights on and the power supply completely
Yeah.
reliable. So could you see that if Australia is turning towards turning off its coal powered stations and going to weather reliant energy supplies, where we are going to have rolling blackouts? What would you say if that was the plan in India? How would the people respond, or how would that affect you? Because you're turning away from that to sustainable and baseload energy supply, whereas Australia is doing the opposite. What would you say as a response to that?
I mean, if at all it is being implemented in India, it would be a total chaos because it's a huge country, right?
Yeah,
So, we cannot sustain. We have not attained 100% energy efficiency, and the load would be more. And to cater to the rising demand of a growing country, that a developing country would be too difficult. And that's why if you see, even in agriculture for that matter, we have surplus in fruits and vegetables, even food grains. But the thing is, we are not able to switch to totally organic methods of farming because it's huge. It takes a lot of time. At least 10 years for a normal land which has been cultivated using pesticides and the fertilizers. It takes time, right? And there
yeah,
will be a shortage of food, and we have been exporting to many countries, so it will get disrupted. Same thing with energy as well. There will be total chaos, and industries will definitely take a hit. So
yeah.
I would suggest that.
So this is where people haven't really. This is where, when you travel a lot and you get to see that where you have intermittent power, or you have power blackouts, and then also network blackouts. Because when I was in Egypt and other nations, where you would have like a network downage, like, and that was just like a common thing. It's like, yeah, it's about 10 o'clock
Yeah.
at night, the system's about to crash, everyone's online, and the
Yeah.
network's overloaded. So we're going to have a crash. So that would be a role. Like, these are things that developing nations have been used to. And this is where I am trying to get through to people here. When you don't have a baseline energy supply, you will have rolling blackouts,
Yeah.
without having a non weather reliant energy system. And so I know that, as you just explained, people would be greatly disadvantaged there in India, because could
Yeah.
you imagine that, there's
Yeah.
too much wind and they've got to turn all the wind power off, or there's,
Yeah.
the grid's overloaded because there's too much sunshine. So they've got to try and find some
Mm.
backup power system. And this is
Correct.
where I look, and, going back to, you only got 33% nuclear power at the moment. But I know that I've seen statistics, although I don't know the exact. I probably should have looked at that before we hopped on here, that
Mhm.
India and China have both increased their coal powered stations for electricity supply. So,
Mhm.
and I'm not perpetuating that, that is the only way to go. I know that there's much better technology out there for us to have super
Yeah.
clean, low ecological impact energy. But the thing is that when you have not reliable or intermittent energy supply, we're going to have a developed nation like Australia losing its baseload energy. And this is where I'm trying to get through to people. When you lose that as a security, as a
Correct.
nation, that then you are no longer a first world nation. Like, sorry, you're not a developed nation. You're going to drop down into like
Correct.
securities of being able to manufacture and have industry. And this is something that you would know very well, correct?
Correct.
So in that, let's talk a little bit about what you've experienced in your time with agriculture, and your conversations with farmers and their needs, and what the growing trend has been. I know you mentioned that going towards being fully organic is almost impossible. That you said that Sri Lanka tried to do this, and their
Yeah.
economy collapsed. But,
Correct.
as far as
Mhm.
like making sure that you don't have a lot of GMOs or genetically modified organisms or plants in India, how does that sit across the board? Because I think it's only fairly limited.
Yeah, we have, as of now, government of India has been very strict with this genetically modified crops.
Good.
The first crop was which was approved was the cotton, and the second recently they came up with genetically modified mustard. So these are the only two that is allowed to commercially be grown by the farmers. Other than that, there is a lot of hue and cry about brinjal,
Okay.
so that was
Yeah.
not allowed. And yeah, in that in that sense, it's a good thing that they're not allowing all these genetically modified crops to be grown. See,
So
India being a huge country, we have so many thousands of varieties of crops, the native ones, which were resilient to all this drought and famine. We need to preserve that. That's the main thing. Instead of going for all these advanced genetically modified things, I'm sure there is a lot of pressure from the MNCs to introduce such things, right? The companies which are
yeah.
doing that, even pharma companies, right? So actually, India, the northeastern part of India has been organic. There are certain states which are 100% organic, and it's beautiful. If you visit those countries, yeah, it feels so good to visit those states, those places which are totally into organic. So gradually it will shift, but that's what, taking into example what we have seen in Sri Lanka, it totally collapsed. The economy totally collapsed because they were heavily reliant on pesticides and fertilizers. The import, to cut down on the import, they shifted to organic farming. And Sri Lanka, being one of the major producers of tea in the world, if I'm not wrong, it's the second largest producer. producer of tea. So all these things, collapsed, and there were a lot of riots, and even the president changed. So all these things happened. We cannot take a chance like that when it comes to a country like India, which is so huge, right? See, implementing these things in countries like Germany or France, which are not as big, as India, and not as diversified as India, it's relatively easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but relatively easy compared to India. In India, it takes time because a
Yeah.
lot of diversification is there. So yeah, we are stuck between, being a very old country with lot of legacy, a great civilization, and also trying to be, catching up with the Western countries to be a developed country, and moreover, we have China, which is a developed country. So there is a lot of pressure to,
Yeah.
compete with China and also emulate China. So that has been the focus.
So as far as so just to put it into perspective, in Australia, our government has been the government that's been in power, is trying to put us totally to renewables,
Mhm.
which it's green renewables, which is not so green, and it's certainly not so clean because it
Mhm.
takes so much carbon and it has a very large carbon footprint for the production, the transportation, and the implementation, like the footings, everything. So to say it's green and clean is not accurate. But then also to say that that's a best solution because it's going to look after the planet. Well,
Mhm.
this is the thing where I see that there's been a lack of balance in any perspective, and it's just ideology. And so, what you're
Yeah.
talking about here is where it seems to be that India is implementing changes as it's coping, as it's like a rollout of those changes. As you said, you've got regions that are pretty much entirely organic, which is amazing. And that's something that, I mean, take your hat off to that because we don't have that much
Mm.
in Australia as well, like it's a real struggle to do that. So you've got that support at a top level of agriculture for a start. You've got that support there because they know that there is a big demand for organics. Then you've
Yeah.
got all of these other industries that are not turning to genetically modified organisms or GMOs that cause all
Mm.
kinds of problems, especially when it comes to food. Um, and to know that India is stuck with its traditional ways, or it's staying with
Yeah.
its traditional or heirloom fruit, vegetables, and plants. That's to me
Yeah.
amazing because there's a lot to
Mm.
be learned from that. Because when you introduce something from that's grown somewhere else and it's GMO, and then you put it in another
Correct.
location where the soils are different, the conditions are different, it grows differently, and then you see that the crop, it takes 2 or 3 generations often for that crop to adjust to all the different
Mm.
bacterium and stuff in the soil. So then we can get like crop failures. So the thing is
And
that
just to add one more thing, yeah,
yes,
just to add one more thing, to that GM. See, the thing is, it's not only adaptability. The main important thing is your farmers will be stuck in the hands of the multinational corporations who are, you need to buy seeds from them. You need to,
yeah,
adhere to the restrictions, whatever they implement, pose on you. And our farmers will not be able to be independently growing whatever they want, right? So that's the major point.
wow. So what you're saying is that you have farming organizations or farming groups that are so strong in their working to collaboratively that they're able to put enough pressure back on the government or external
Yeah,
foreign powers or forces to say that no, we don't want this because to go
yeah,
with just this way means that the rights of farmers will be taken away.
exactly. Actually, a couple of years back, see, there are two things here. One is the thing is there is also a lot of politics involved here. Recently, I mean, just 2 years back, Indian government wanted to introduce a farm bill. There was a lot of noise over it,
Yeah,
and the Western agenda tried to portray it as, it is anti-farming, anti-farmers, and it is not at all good for the farmers and all. In fact, even Rihanna and all these people also got involved who have no sense of what farming is exactly, what is the ground situation over here. They just played by the textbook, whatever was given to them. So India government had to actually withdraw the bill, the farming bill. I read the bill, and I personally felt that it was very good for the farmers because they were able to enter into contact with an independent company, and they could sell at whatever price they want, and that is not the case as of now. There is something called as APMC, where it's a government based farm society, where you have to go there and sell it as per their price, and there will be a lot of middlemen who will
Yes.
manipulate the price, and ultimately the beneficiary is not the farmer who has toiled hard in his land and grown the crop, but it is the middlemen who are taking away a lot of commission. So some of the vested powers also intervened in this. They did a lot of protest in the capital city, and for more than a year, a lot of road blockages were there, and finally the government had to budge because election was coming up. So yeah,
Those good old elections. A lot of pressure at
yes,
election time gets
yes,
things
yes,
achieved, doesn't it?
yeah, a lot of
Well,
dynamics.
yes. So essentially, what you're saying is that there's still too much middleman involved in agriculture or negotiations between farmers and mm, exportation on a government level. Is that correct?
Yeah, see, on one side you have the farmer, then the farmer, whatever he has grown in small piece of land. See, as per my whatever statistics I know, 70% of the farmers in India have a land which is less than 3 acres. They don't have huge
Wow.
holding. Yeah, they're all small farmers. So whatever little they can grow, they don't have any choice, because most of the crops are perishable, right? And because of the power shortage in rural areas, there are no cold storage containers because it needs 24-hour power supply, right? So they have to sell it to the farm at whatever rate is available, decided by the middleman. And moreover, the thing is, these perishable items also, I have seen many times where they don't get the right prices, and they just throw it on the road in frustration, because a farmer has to be too much reliant on, first of all, the weather is not, you know weather is not reliant, and moreover he has to borrow some money and grow the crops, and when you go to the society to sell, you might not get the cost price as well, so they throw it out, and in frustration and anger. So I've seen all these things,
Wow.
and farmers
So
commit
I'm
suicide.
so we, in contrast to that, Australian has fairly good transportation and storage. However, we have um, what seems to be that middleman that you have the problem with there. We have
Yeah.
not enough support for farmers in some ways that I see. Not Farmers are getting ripped off by organizations, authorities that interface with the government, where they,
Mhm.
they're purchasing. There's big conglomerates. We know that the big, yeah,
Yeah.
supermarket chains and stuff. They dictate a lot of what the price is,
Mhm.
and so farmers are always undercut, and they're not being represented well for getting the price that they should get. It all of course, is the big, big cut goes to the supermarkets and those big authorities.
Mhm.
It's a little bit similar, but a little bit different also. So it's good to see that the farmers have quite strong organizations within them. I wish that they could find a way to put more pressure on those middlemen to stop them from
Mhm.
taking so much of the profit there, because that's just definitely something that obviously everyone's going to be aware of. That's where
Yeah.
farmers are really losing out with all of the effort and all of the,
Mhm.
because they're the ones who bear all the stresses. That's universal. Um, in Australia, I think that having a farm would have to mean that there would be a minimum of 10 to 20 acres that you would
Oh.
start a farm from. So it's interesting because of the different
Mhm.
type of farming that we have. In saying that, we have a huge country, as you said,
Yeah.
and that's another thing that we have our
Mhm.
government that is trying to stop the live exportation of sheep. So
Oh.
that's a huge one here because we do live sheep exportation
Mhm.
out of Western Australia, where I live.
Okay.
And the impact of that on our sheep trade and our whole industry of farming is going to be
Mhm.
pretty catastrophic. So
Oh.
we we know that we send a lot of Arab nations, as well as I think that we
Mhm.
do export to India as well.
Mm.
Um, so the thing is that we have our government trying to shut down our industries, which is
Mm.
really, really distressing. Um, if that was tried, say that in India, just for a comparison, that
Mhm.
they were going to shut down the cotton industry for some reason, could you imagine what the farmers would probably respond to the government as? So you've already said that they've already been protesting out in the streets. What would you say that probably would happen in India if your government came along and said, oh, no, we're not going to grow cotton anymore and we're not going to have a whole cotton growing industry and textiles? What would happen, do you think?
Government has to, fall.
Bye bye, government. Yeah, I
Yeah,
agree.
definitely.
And so I think this has really nailed where the issue is because you have very strong industries and manufacturing in India. And so, as much as a developed nation like Australia or Canada or the US would all look and say, oh, we're developed nations, except our manufacturing and industries have been decimated. And this
Oh.
is why, because India has retained that and retained those ancient traditions, and for us,
Mhm.
it's age-old traditions that have been the backbone of our nation to have the exportation of sheep and wheat, as well as wool. These are the industries that create the backbone and the foundation of this nation. That's what it was founded on,
Mhm.
pretty much, those exportation.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
that gave us a great footing and value. If you could imagine that throwing away the backbone of your nation as industries and
Mhm.
manufacturing,
Yeah.
it's incomprehensible, isn't it?
Definitely. So I just wanted to ask you, like, is Australia energy deficient when it comes to electricity, or does it have surplus?
Okay, so in I can talk for Western Australia, and I know a little bit because Western Australia is its own grid, so we are not connected to other states. There's a couple of towns that are on borders that have some crossover energy supply, but predominantly our entire state of Western Australia is its own grid, and that grid, that energy grid, the electricity system is owned by the people and the public of Western Australia. And we keep repeating this over and over again. So by allowing foreign corporations where they take all the
Mhm.
profit and we pay exorbitant prices for electricity that is not going to be baseload and not going to have energy security, we are
Mhm.
essentially handing over our energy security to foreign corporations, which is very disturbing. On
Mhm.
the east, so we have a big coal-powered energy power station here that
Mhm.
provides a huge amount. I think it's 80% of our energy comes from coal still. I know some is natural gas, the same as in
Mhm.
India. And then we have a very small amount of other energies that feed onto the grid. So we do know that the maximum supply, which is it's actually reflected in what you get in as part of your 27% energy supply from across the board in your grid is from renewables. So that's within the 27%. But we know that renewables are only efficient, green renewables are only efficient to 25 to 27% at the highest point. So
Mhm.
that's reflected in what we're seeing in India or anywhere else in the world. So there's no separation of that. On the East Coast, they've already shut down some coal-powered stations, and they have had rolling blackouts.
Oh.
So in Western Australia, we have a lot of people with solar panels on their roofs, and they
Mhm.
feed into the grid. And what's happening is there's so many solar panels on roofs in Western Australia that there's so much
Mm.
energy during the day that they have to shut off the parts of the grid that are feeding on,
Oh.
because the grid is overloaded. So we have an overloaded grid. We don't have an energy deficit at all. What we
Mhm.
require is our energy grids to be upgraded,
Okay.
and we need to have supplemented energy supply if we're turning away from coal. So we have our own
Mm.
natural gas refineries in Western Australia. We are very rich in natural gas, and that is, we already have natural gas lines that come all the way down from where they're refined up north from here. So it's a very simple process to expand that, to keep it very economical for the people of Western Australia in particular. I think
Mm.
the estimates where it was going to cost $250 million to expand the gas supply from where it exists and change that down to where the system uh, flows
Mm.
onto the grid near the power station. So when you look at it, there's very common sense solutions that are already in place that we don't really need to make a lot of changes for, and they're
Mhm.
only a fraction of what it would be to keep continuing to put money in the pockets of foreign corporations. So
Mm.
in India, do you have a situation where the government entirely governs or owns your power stations and all of your power supply? You don't have foreign corporations that come in and they basically take over, the nuclear plant, or this is it all owned by the Indian government?
So India is actually a mixed economy. So we have a mix of socialistic as well as the capitalist economy. So majority of the companies, majority of these kind of basic infrastructure companies are owned by the government. So in a way, it's good. When it comes to power, yes, majority of the companies are owned by the government of India. So here, one thing what I can probably suggest people of Australia can do who are predominantly farmers is that, see, here what is happening is government is encouraging farmers who have large tracts of land which are barren, which are predominantly in areas where there is lot of sunshine and less of rainfall. So they're asking people to have solar panels. They're subsidizing solar panels to generate electricity and sell it to the government. So the same thing can be implemented in Australia, I'm sure, because the central part of Australia is full of desert, right? So farmers over there can definitely, instead of growing crops, the Australian government can subsidize the solar panels and they can start growing, generating electricity.
The thing is that in Australia, what we're finding is that a lot of the solar arrays, which is what they're, solar panel
Mhm.
arrays, are actually on agricultural land, which is counterproductive when it comes to looking after vital agricultural land. And this is the problem. The arid areas in Australia are a long distance away from the power grids. And so what
Okay.
happens? So this is again understanding sort of the dynamics of populations that are vastly different from
Mhm.
India and Australia,
Okay.
obviously. But also, the climatic regions, up in the north, you're still going to have large cities and towns and areas that are arid, that's probably possible. And they can put it in an
Mhm.
area where they're not going to have issues with livestock on the same land
Mm.
as where they're going to have
Yeah.
solar arrays in Australia. And this is where the concern is that with damage that comes from a lot of storms that where solar arrays are destroyed, uh,
Hmm.
there is legislation that's been put in place that if the government feels that your land is contaminated and toxic by possible having these solar panels broken and go into the soil. Yeah. So if that happens, the government can come along and determine that your agricultural
Mhm.
land is no longer fit for purpose and take it back off you and rehabilitate it. And so you no longer have your property. So you no longer have an income. And so this is where people go, no, that's not true. It's like, yes, it is. So
Mhm.
again, the difference and the contrast of what does work in India. What again? It's about logistics. It's what's available at the time. Do you think that I've seen a lot of developing nations, especially in South Africa? You may have seen it or may not. There are inventors that have come up with energy solutions. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
if you've seen that, where there's a gentleman in South Africa that's come up with a completely
Mm-hmm.
clean, renewable, free energy device. Could you imagine that India would be one of those nations that would be first to invest in free energy to put into, obviously, more isolated or communities out there that need to be more sustainable and off grid, because whether that's the transmission lines or the energy grid is probably a bit run down. I know that there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
flooding that happens, so there's obviously a need for that. Do you think that India would be a nation that might jump onto the free and clean energy supply?
Definitely, yes. I mean, there is a set of population which is, city educated, and a lot of awareness is there when it comes to all these off-grid houses and all. And a certain parts, there are few communities which are actually wanting to have such, communities
Yeah.
totally off the grid.
Wow. That's
Definitely,
awesome.
yeah, we would definitely embrace that.
So this is where I think the comparison to where like the geopolitical stuff that's going on in India is very much about taking back power and making the nation as strong as possible, independently as
Yeah.
it is in India, for what's viable economically at the time, and how they can keep increasing um, or implementing these changes as they're not only
Mm.
available, but it's feasible, and the logistics work, which to me is like, gee, it's looking at things in a very common sense approach, as opposed to us that are throwing everything out the window, because
Yeah.
um, we have really strict laws and acts in Australia where you can't go and destroy habitat and cause biodiversity loss. However, under
Mm.
the overarching climate change agenda, um, we are now throwing out any measures to protect habitat and
Mm.
biodiversity, and now we're causing habitat loss and biodiversity loss because of these clean, not clean, green renewables, and this ideology that says that we need to be
Mhm.
having these as our best solution, which I think is the complete opposite. Aditya, we've also talked about, you and I are both very spiritual people, and we've talked about how there is a change in the patterns of the way that people in society is going. And I know in Australia, I'm seeing very much consciousness change. Um,
Mhm.
and I know that we have talked a little bit about that in the past, of how we're coming into a whole new cycle. And one of the things that's part of your tradition and culture in India is the yuga cycles, and the fact that we're coming out of the end of a yuga cycle that's been very powerful in a time of great change. Could you maybe break that down a little bit for people, to just in a few sentences, so people can comprehend that, you know, in Hindu religion, that there are cycles that we go through in our consciousness or awareness and developing
Yes.
as human beings.
Correct. Yeah. So when we see, the changes on this planet in a bigger scale, bigger time scale. So in our ancient texts, we have divided the time scale. It's called a yuga. What is a yuga? Yuga is uh, a time period where a lot of spiritual changes happen on a planet. So when we take Earth, we call Earth as a uh, Bhu Loka. Bhu means earth, Loka means it's a particular plane. So in Hindu mythology, we see that there is a huge a cosmic egg, which has 14 planes of existence. So in this 14 planes of existence, each level of each plane or each level of existence has a gradation where spiritual energies are different. So
Yeah.
Earth belongs to the seventh category or the seventh plane of existence, where there is equal opportunity for good and bad. So
Mhm.
only on the planets where there is this yuga change, you have this something called as the golden age, where 20,000 years you have pure spirituality, where there is no negativity, absolutely no materialism, no duality. Then we have 15,000 years of change, where there is a little bit of negativity introduced by the creator, that is called as the Treta Yuga. Then we have 10,000 years of Dwapara Yuga, where almost 30% of negativity is introduced. And then we have the Kali Yuga, or the Dark Age, as we call it, 5,000
Yeah.
years of Dark Age. So all the four combined together is called one Mahayuga, which is 51,840 years. Generally, it is believed that we have hundreds of thousands of years of Kali Yuga left. It is a misconception, and it is also a distortion. But what my guru, who was a great saint, he told us, was that this is the exact thing, and in 1974 we came out of the Kali Yuga, that is the dark age, right?
Mhm.
So we are now in a transition period of 49 years from 1987. I'm sure you might be knowing about the harmonic convergence that happened in 87, right? There is a huge
Mhm.
shift in consciousness. So from that time onwards, there has been lot of changes that has been happening. Even in Bible, it is mentioned that it is the year,
Mhm.
the time of judgment before the coming
Mhm.
of the Christ, right?
Mhm.
So that is the period that we are in, and that is why I feel that we are having all these climatic changes. It's not man-made, but it is,
Mhm.
of nature. And I read somewhere that the poles of the sun have shifted, flipped
Mhm.
in 2000, and same is happening with the earth as well. The poles are actually drifting. The north pole has drifted almost 40%, in the past 60 years, which is it's moving
Yes.
towards Siberia now, right? Scientifically also we know that. So all this magnetic field getting weakened, and the poles being flipped, all these things are because of the yuga change that is happening. The judgment time has come.
And this is why I think that all of these discussions, when we are opening up our minds to looking at things with different comprehension or putting in different factors that we hadn't put in before. This is why I say to people, if you understand that the sun has cycles, you understand that these things have cycles, that the magnetic grid, like when it
Correct.
becomes weakened, we have changes in our climatic um, regions that are
Yeah.
unpredictable, where we have intense fluctuations. We've had that where I live. We had a heat
Mhm.
wave, and then it got freezing cold, and then it rained
Yeah.
today, and then I'm just like, oh my gosh, like this is crazy weather. But this is all what we're navigating. I believe it's all for a higher purpose, for us to start to look at sharing ancient wisdom, because even farmers will say this cycle that we're going through now is similar to what we had like somewhere like 40 something years ago. And so when I hear
Mhm.
very wise farmers share these stories, then I think, okay, so we don't need to respond it with hysteria. What we need to look into the comprehension of what cycles were the same and what's changed, and what are the different factors. And so this is
Correct.
exactly what you've talked about, that you, in your culture, in your religious belief system, that you see that there are these cycles that repeat themselves, and then they
Correct.
have different influences within that. So now we're coming into an age where it's the ending or degrading of the dark time. So we have to see all the dark before we can move
Correct.
into the light. So this is where we're
Correct.
at right now for these 49 years,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Exactly.
So this is where the timeline 2030 does come in, and this is where, like, whether you're looking at it from a positive or negative perspective of whose plan has got what, for those that
Yeah.
are aware, knowing that this consciousness change is happening, and that's why we're seeing it geopolitically. That's why we're seeing people change their opinions and the way that they see the world. It's so important. So all I can say is that having this conversation consolidates a lot for me. So thank you for that. I know that I've already done a little bit of research into the Yuga cycles, but That's fantastic. I think we'll dive into this another time. Let's talk about that again
Yeah,
for sure. But
sure.
as far as you see, what do you see as the changes on the horizon for India? Do you see, for me, I look at there's a rise in the feminine energy, that there's a rebalancing of the masculine dominance and coming back
Correct.
into greater respect for
Yeah.
womanhood, motherhood, the sanctity of childbirth and looking after the planet. Is that something you're seeing being mirrored in India at the moment?
Before getting into that point, so when you mentioned about the shift in the masculine and the feminine energies,
Yeah.
yes, actually, if we observe, majority of the wars have been fought in countries which is above the equator,
Yeah.
because they are predominantly masculine, and the countries below the equator are predominantly feminine, right? Even
Yeah.
Australia is predominantly feminine. I had been to South America in 2018, Peru and Bolivia, all the sacred sites, and when I
Wow.
observed men and women there, I could see a lot of feminine energies in them. Men were not at all aggressive, that alpha male types, so I could clearly see that the energies were very feminine, right? And I feel that because of the yuga transformation that has happened, the redistribution of these energies have happened, and slowly people are awakening the feminine within, and that is what the
Yeah.
transformation is happening. And when it comes to India, because we were subjugated, by the colonial rule for more than 300 years, and more than 700 years of Islamic invasion and all. So slowly, all those suppressed energies are coming out, expressing itself. I can see a little bit of changes, when it comes to feminine. But the thing is, what saddens me is that we are trying to ape the West. You know,
Yeah.
feminism is actually taking center stage, which I don't feel that it is the proper way of expressing or balancing the feminine energies.
I think feminism has been hijacked. Instead of it being a natural intrinsic thing, it's done as a revengeful thing. And that's how
Yeah,
it's like,
yeah,
well, no, that's again, it's hijacked energy. But I think that
definitely.
we're starting to see that as you recognize it, that's the same thing that's being recognized in
Hmm.
Australia also. Thank you
Okay.
so much for joining me today.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was very nice, having a good conversation with you after a long time. And let's catch up again.
Absolutely. Thank you, and keep being as positive and amazing as you are. And I look
Yes,
forward to further discussions. And maybe one day I'll come and visit in India.
definitely. You're welcome.
Thanks. Take care.
Yeah.
This has
Thank you.
been
Bye
Edge Radio
bye.
Australia.